Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. Well, I look forward to making some comments in relation to the Future Made in Australia tax credit legislation. And in doing so, I think it would be remiss not to reflect on the fact that the government has had 3 years and they have no policies for growth other than policies which propose to enact a centralised system of government handouts to businesses that are already doing the business themselves. And when you think about the best way for us to manage this economy going forward, of course it is going to be for the market itself to fund and to develop its own ideas. Because, of course, the last time I looked, we weren't living in Soviet Russia, we weren't living in an autocracy, and in fact we had, up until recently, had almost 3 decades of growth because of fidelity to economic and market principles. But now we have a government which has done nothing other than run the country in favour of vested interests for 3 years, where they have gummed up the works of small business with their endless ideological crusade created by the unions and foisted on the Australian people and small business by the Labor Party, which has led to it being harder than ever to run a small business in this country. The regulatory burden, the lack of imagination on the tax front, and then the skyrocketing energy prices all mean that the country has anaemic growth and still has comparatively high inflation. And then we come to this monster of a $22 billion handout to big business called Future Made in Australia. Now, it is to the country's credit that we have institutions which are independent of the government of the day, where the people who are running those are able to give their own frank and fearless advice to ministers and to the public at large. And the head of the Productivity Commission, Danielle Wood, appointed by Mr Chalmers, has said in relation to the Future Made in Australia, we risk creating a class of businesses that is reliant on government subsidies, and that can be very effective in coming back for more. In other words, the government is creating a cavalcade of lobbyists coming to Canberra with their handout to take taxpayer funds to pump into businesses which may be uncompetitive or may just be propping up something that they were going to do anyway. That is Future Made in Australia. I don't think I can do any better job than quoting the head of the Productivity Commission, the government's own advisor on economic and productivity matters. But then, of course, we look at the former head of the Productivity Commission, Gary Banks, who said that Future Made in Australia was a quote-unquote fool's errand. And Mr Banks went on to say that it risks repeating the mistakes of the past by propping up political favourites. And I think it is extraordinary when you think about the history of this issue and, frankly, the great work that was done by the Hawke government in tearing down the tariff wall and ending the subsidisation of Australian industry, which was very hard to do. Very hard to do. And all the insiders and all the political dorks will give their opinions about who supported what in the 80s and 90s and how much bipartisanship there was. But there was bipartisanship in the 80s on the idea of reducing the tariff wall and then ending subsidisation, because it was recognised by people with brains that there were some things that Australia wasn't good at doing. There were some things that we were never going to be able to compete on. And therefore, the government should not step into the shoes of industry and try and run these businesses for them and prop them up with the taxpayers' hard-earned. That debate was won. And what was the dividend? It was 30 years of growth. 30 years of growth. So here we are seeing the government engaging in trampling upon the Hawke legacy. Maybe it is amnesia. My understanding was that the Treasurer had done a doctorate on the Keating government on Paul Keating. And if he can still remember that doctorate, he would know that the treasurer in the Keating government was Paul Keating. And he was, of course, an advocate for this approach because he understood the danger of maintaining the settlement which sustained through government subsidy uncompetitive businesses. That risked our prosperity then, and this risks our prosperity now by creating a class of businesses which are totally reliant on Canberra's teat. That is the risk here with this scheme. And that is why, I think, the productivity commissioners, past, present and maybe in the future, I don't know, have all taken the view that this is very bad. And I commend Ms Wood for being brave enough to exercise her independence in that role and to criticise this policy of Future Made in Australia. Now, of course, there are a few examples in the current marketplace where we have seen programs like the Sunshot program, which apparently has not been supported by the Treasury Secretary, has actually not proven its worth. And furthermore, Fortescue, which is proposing to engage in some green hydrogen initiatives, has decided that it would actually cut back what it was proposing to do, even though this policy has been announced. So that is the overall charge against this policy. But in Labor's agenda here, of course, one thing that is never far from the surface is a desire to try and lock in some dollars for their good friends at the trade union movement. And they have done this on this occasion through the community benefit principles. Now, these were the subject of the Senate Economics Committee's review of the principal legislation, but also of the legislation that the Senate is now considering in relation to tax credits. Now, the AMWU provided evidence to the initial Senate inquiry, and they said in relation to the community benefit principles, quote, that we at the AMWU want well-paid, safe, secure jobs, and that's why the jobs from this should have union agreements. They should be unionised. So that was their opinion, and that is exactly what this government is delivering in the form of the community benefit principles. They are proposing that if there are to be contracts issued under the Future Made in Australia arrangements, that they must have union agreements. And this is going to be a very ugly moment for the country, because if this is passed by this parliament and Future Made in Australia becomes a law, and then the agreements to give away taxpayer funds to uncompetitive businesses have as a condition a requirement to have a union agreement which saps productivity and ultimately sees what we've been able to have exposed by the 9 newspapers through their building inquiries. The construction industry has a 20 or 30% tax on it imposed by the CFMEU because, of course, the productivity drain is there because the union is doing business for itself, not in the public interest, and certainly that has had a massive effect on the cost of the apartment construction around Australia. So what you will see is a CFMEU tax effect applied wherever you see Future Made in Australia appear. It could be anywhere, in any business. And then what you start to see is the Argentinian disease. You start to see the vested interests infect and entrap the country's economy through this locking in of largesse to vested interests, where they have their grubby hands and mitts in every single transaction. And who's paying? It's the taxpayer. The taxpayer would have to pay for this. So in the end, the taxpayer ends up paying for the largesse locked into the legislation. Now, the Minerals Council, I thought, had a very interesting comment when they came to the secondary inquiry, where they made the point that at the end of the day that they're already meeting a lot of the standards that you'd see in the legislation, and that there'd be duplication through the community benefit principles. I thought also there was some interesting testimony from the Clean Energy Council, Ms Anna Freeman, who made the point that we remain concerned about the potential duplication of the process created by community benefit principles. Now, this is the Clean Energy Council. They have the same view as the Minerals Council and the Business Council. So all the business groups have a concern about these community benefit principles. Some of them fairly have a concern that they are woolly, but others, of course, have my concern, which is what you're going to see is a CFMEUisation of the broader economy and the locking in of this largesse. But as I said at the opening, none of this should be surprising, because the major problem the Australian people have is that they have had a government for 3 years which has spent its time lining the pockets of its blood-sucking mates at the unions, the super funds, the class action law firms, and they haven't had time to solve the real economic problems facing the Australian people, which is why they've failed on inflation and is why they have failed on housing, because they are a government for vested interests. And when they get out of their bed every day, they think about what are the 10 things we can do for the people that run our pre-selections, that fund our campaigns, that talk to us every day, that write our policies. And that is the problem that the Australian people have. And that is why we're not on track in this country, because when you run the country for the favour of a few bloodsuckers, you actually do run the show into the ground. And that is where we are right now in this country. And the future made in Australia is wonderfully consistent with the past 3 years of this government's agenda. Wonderfully consistent. If you look at anything to do with industrial relations, superannuation, the broader economy, future made in Australia is more largesse for unions. But as I said before, I would encourage Mr Chalmers, or Dr Chalmers, whatever he calls himself, to have a read of his doctoral thesis on Mr Keating. And in that, he will find that Mr Keating was a treasurer in the Hawke government, which pulled down the tariff wall and ended the subsidisation of Australian industry for the better. For the better. So I would encourage him to do that, because I think if he's able to rediscover the old dusty thesis, or whatever it was, he will learn a valuable lesson. This is the road to ruin. Not only is it going to pave the roads, the Barton Highway and the Federal Highway, with gold from all the lobbyists and all the bloodsuckers, it is also going to establish a massive sovereign risk here that future ministers and bureaucrats are going to have to work out how they're going to dish all this cash out, billions and millions of dollars every single year. So I think this is a bad idea, and I think if the government can set aside all the politics and reflect on what it has learnt in the past couple of years, I think maybe it has learnt that it's not a great idea to establish these big funds. The Reconstruction Fund, firstly, no one knows what we're reconstructing from. That is sitting on tens of billions of dollars that hasn't done anything. Then we've got the Housing Fund, which spends more money on executive salaries than it does on housing. And the government's building fewer houses than were achieved, vastly fewer houses than were achieved under the past government. So bureaucracies do not build houses. Bureaucracies do not reconstruct from wars, whatever we've had, which I'm not sure why we're having a reconstruction. And then finally, this will be the same thing. I think in the end they will regret this plan because it is fraught with risk and it fails to learn the lessons of Australia's recent history. Australia will grow if there is a fair income approach to supporting businesses that can stand on their own 2 feet. Small business, medium business, big business, who cares? But they will prosper with clearer taxes, lower taxes, fewer regulations. That is going to be the path to prosperity. The idea of subsidising bad ideas, bad businesses with taxpayer funds and simultaneously allowing that to be funnelled away to the unions, to CFMEU and all the other old mates is the road to ruin. It is the road to turning Australia into Argentina, and that is why we are voting against these bills. And I say for the record that I think Argentinians are wonderful people.